a number of halachas. One had to do with the way of reading the Gemara about shlakos, regarding shlakos. Shlakos are cooked vegetables. Does cooking change does cooking change the term that's used for the vegetable? Is the vegetable no longer considered a fruit, if it's cooked or not? And so we mentioned that there's a way of understanding the Gemara that it's not that Reb Chia bar Abba and Reb Binyamin bar Yefes are arguing, and the Gemara is saying obviously you should follow Reb Chia bar Abba instead of Reb Binyamin bar Yefes, but there is a different way of learning that the Gemara is saying Reb Chia bar Abba is so reliable that Reb Binyamin bar Yefes is obviously not arguing with him. He's just explaining and qualifying his statement. Then the next Gemara spoke about the story of two stories. One story was this bean called a turmasa, which is cooked 7 times. And Rabbi Yochanan said, you recite the bracha bar pri adama. So that seemed to be a proof that shlakos, cooked vegetables, still retain their bracha bar pri adama. And then we had another story of Reb Chia bar Abba saying that he saw Rabbi Yochanan eating a zayas maliach, this salted olive, and he recited a bracha in the beginning and in the end, and that's all he said. That's the story. And the Gemara tries to prove that it must be that the bracha that he recited on the olive was a Borei Pri Ha'etz. And even though it's salted, which salting is similar to cooking, and it could maybe make it lose its term pri, that we wouldn't call it any longer a pri because it's been changed from being a fruit of the tree to something else, to a processed food now. Now it's considered maybe processed. And the fact that he recited a bracha in the beginning and in the end means that we do look at it, that it still retains its name called a fruit. And we're not looking at it as processed foods. We look at it as a fruit. It's a fruit of the tree, Borei Pri Ha'etz. It's an olive. And therefore, the bracha on it was Ha'etz, and he recited an after blessing. Had it been changed, if we would consider the olive through salting it causes it to be changed, that it's now considered more like a processed food rather than a fruit of the tree, then the initial bracha would not be ha'etz. The initial bracha would be shehakol, and the Gemara's understanding that there would not be an after blessing. And the fact that he recited an after blessing can tell us that the initial blessing must have been a ha'etz. So that's the initial understanding of the Gemara. And then the Gemara disproves it. It says, how do you know this? Maybe he would recite a Borei Nefashos afterwards. And even if he started off with a Shehakol bracha, the after blessing would be a Borei Nefashos, the general after blessing. So what was the difference between the way the Gemara understood it initially and the way the Gemara understands it in the end? The difference was if Rabbi Yochanan, Chia bar Abba, saying the story about Rabbi Yochanan, if they followed this view that we're going to see later on in the chapter, that Borei Nefashos is only recited on certain foods, and other foods you don't recite an after blessing. So if Rabbi Yochanan followed that view, then that would be a very good proof. The fact that he recited an after blessing obviously is because he said a Borei Pri Ha'etz in the beginning. However, the Gemara in the end, the way the Gemara answers this proof and disproves the proof or abolishes the proof, the way the Gemara does that is by saying we don't know if Rabbi Yochanan follows that view. Maybe Rabbi Yochanan follows the common view, which is that we recite Bari Nefashos after all foods that don't fall into any other category. We recite a Bari Nefashos. So again, there's an argument later on in the Gemara about when does Bari Nefashos recited? Is it only specific foods like meat or eggs? Or is the Bari Nefashos recited on all other foods that don't fall into the category of the Al Hamichya or grace after meal? Is the Bari Nefashos used for all those foods? Now, we use Bari Nefashos as a very general after blessing, so we obviously follow that view. And that's the way the Gemara seems to conclude here, that Dilma Bari Nefashos Rabbis, that maybe that's the story here that Rabbi Yochanan said at Bari Nefashos, and you don't have a proof what the first bracha is, because it could be that he said a shahakal because salting changed it from its initial bracha of ha'etz. Now, the Gemara now jumps into another challenge, and that is a challenge regarding maror on Pesach, maror, the bitter herbs. And we know that regarding bitter herbs, the intent is that we should feel the bitterness, right? We're supposed to taste the bitterness and remember the suffering that the Jewish people had in Egypt. And the maror, the bitter herbs, obviously are supposed to give us that feeling. So or at least that symbolism. So the bitter herbs that we eat. So the Mishnah in Tractate Psachim, it tells us how do those bitter herbs have to be. So it says that you could have them, the leaves, the stalks, but they're not allowed to be soaked in vinegar, and they also cannot be mevushal. They can't be shaluk or mevushal. Shaluk and mevushal literally just both mean cooked, but we translated shaluk means more than regular cooking. Can't be shaluk. You can't cook it for a lengthy period of time, and you can't just mevushal. You can't just cook it regular cooking, and so these are not allowed. You won't fulfill the mitzvah of maror if you cook it, if you process it the wrong way, because the initial understanding of the Gemara is once you cook it, you lose its term vegetable that it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be a pri-ha'adama, a fruit of the ground. And once you cook it, it's not considered that anymore. It's something processed. So being processed through cooking, the Gemara is understanding that if you can't, that shaluk should also be we should see from here that something that's cooked loses its name of being a pri-ha'adam. The Gemara answers, very simple answer based on previous Gemara. The previous Gemara told us about the taste of matzah, that you need to have the taste of matzah. Here also the Gemara says it doesn't mean that it's not a vegetable anymore. It means that it's still could still be called a vegetable even if it's cooked. However, it doesn't have the taste of the maror that it's supposed to have. And because it doesn't have the taste of maror, that's why you don't fulfill the obligation of maror by having this cooked bitter herbs. It doesn't have the tam maror. Now I have to clarify that the Gemara earlier we mentioned that you need to have the matzah needs to have the taste of matzah. And however, if a person swallowed matzah without having the taste, he would still fulfill the obligation. I brought you a very interesting essay of the Lubavitcher Rebbe on it. It's, that the matzah symbolizes the exodus that was done in a hasty way, and being in such haste, they weren't able to absorb the great revelations that Hashem was shining upon the Jewish people. They had to simply run out of Egypt, because if they stayed any longer in Egypt, they would have been taken from they would have been pulled into the lowest depths of impurity. Therefore, they needed to run hastily out of Egypt, and by doing that, the exodus, they weren't able to fully absorb it. So it didn't have the taste of someone who enjoys and understands what they're doing. They simply were being saved from Egypt, but without the full enjoyment of it and absorbing what was being given to them. When did they finally absorb the exodus from Egypt? That was at the giving of the Torah. They had to prepare themselves for it. They prepared for 49 days. Then they were able to really absorb. And if you, it's interesting because the first 3 verses that talk about the exodus of Egypt, there's 4 verses. The reason why we have 4 cups of wine, because there's 4 verses about the exodus from Egypt. Now, the first 3 are all about how Hashem took us out momentarily. The 4th one is V'lakachti eschem li la'am. I took you for me to be my nation. Now, rabbis tell us that refers that we became Hashem's nation really at the giving of the Torah. That was fully, that was completed at the giving of the Torah. So really, there's only 3 of the terms that were used, but for the Exodus, talked about the actual Exodus that took place at that moment. And in fact, that could be a reason why we have 3 matzahs and not 4. Even though cups of wine, we have 4 cups of wine. But the matzah symbolizes what happened when we left Egypt right there and then. And we only had those 3 terms that involved the Exodus that happened right there and then, which we weren't able to fully absorb. And therefore, matzah, it has to be, we have to eat the matzah. We have a mitzvah to eat matzah. And we don't have to taste it because they didn't absorb what they were, the full revelation there either. But in the matzah itself, there needs to be the potential. Just like when they left Egypt, they had the potential to be Hashem's nation and to fully absorb it. And they did finally reach that after 49 days. So we also have to have the potential for taste in the matzah. So that's the idea of the matzah, although you don't have to taste the matzah, but the matzah has to have the taste of matzah in the matzah. You don't have to taste it because just like when we left Egypt, we didn't fully absorb the revelation that was happening then. But we did what we left. We left in haste, the chipazon. And the same thing is the matzah, it has to have that taste of matzah. Now, I'm emphasizing this because when it comes to maror, not only does the maror need to have the taste of maror, the bitter herbs has to taste like, but it has to have the taste of bitter herbs in it. But if you swallow the bitter herbs without tasting it, you don't fulfill your obligation. So it doesn't help by stuffing it down your throat without tasting it. The maror you're supposed to taste. So it's different than the matzah. Now, the Gemara used the same term because both of them need to have the taste of maror. And if you cook the maror, you don't have the taste. But I'm just mentioning this, that you also need to taste the maror physically, and it's not enough to just swallow the maror. So that's how the Gemara answered this question about maror, the bitter herbs, and reciting a bari pri ha'adama regarding cooked vegetables. And that's how the Gemara reconciles that. Now, the Gemara then asks a very interesting question, and that is that what happens if you eat an olive? Do you recite an after blessing? We see Rabbi Yochanan did. The Gemara is surprised. How did he do that? An olive is not the size of an olive. Why not? The Gemara says he took out the pit. If he took out the pit, it's not the size of the olive. So how did he recite an after blessing? So what's the Gemara's answer? Anyone? What did the Gemara answer?
He had a big olive.
He had a big olive. Very good. So he had a big olive. So he was able to eat the olive and skip the pit, and he still had an olive size, because the olive that the rabbis spoke about when it came to the laws of eating the kazayas, and according to some, this applies also to the laws of tumah, that the rabbis said the size of an olive. So when the rabbis spoke about an olive, they spoke about a medium-sized olive. Now, it's interesting because there is question as to in today's day and age, what did they mean when they said a medium? Today, we have our size olives. But were the size olives that they spoke about the same sizes as we have today? Or were things maybe bigger in those days? But in any event, the way the Gemara says it is, the Gemara spoke about the rabbi spoke about a medium-sized olive, and the one they brought in front of Rabbi Yochanan was a large olive. And even if they took out the pit, nevertheless it still had the right size in order to recite an after blessing. And then they brought a proof from a Mishnah that there's a Mishnah that says that that the rabbi spoke about a Beinani, an olive, and they also when the Rabbi Avo explained that Mishnah, he said that it's really not called that. The Mishnah says it's a Beinani and it's called Aguri. Rabbi Avo explained, he says it's not really called Aguri, it's Abruti, Samrutzi, but it's called Aguri because it's shemen, it's oil, is Agur B'Seichoi, it's entered into it, which means that it's ready to leave out, to exit it. It's gathered in it, but it's ready to exit the olive, and therefore that's what they referred to when they spoke about this olive. Now, we also mentioned yesterday that why does the Gemara bring this additional point about that it's called aguri, so that it's explaining that how did the rabbis know that this is the olive size that they refer that should be followed? Why are they choosing this size? And so the explanation is that the verse says Zayis Zeis Shemen. In the verse, it says a olive that has oil about to exit. And so when the verse says Zeis Shemen, Bavo explains it means this type of olive, and that the shemen is ogur b'soicha. The shemen is gathered in it, and it's ready to exit it. So that's what the Torah means, and that's the measurement of achila, of what eating is. Eating is the size of an olive, and that's what it refers to. Okay, so we've now concluded what we got up to yesterday. Now, I should mention there is another answer to this question in the Gemara. The Gemara asked, what is the reason why Rabbi Yochanan made a bracha achrona, did an after blessing, if he only ate an olive, and when you take out the seed, the olive is no longer the size of an olive. The Jerusalem Talmud has another answer to this question. What is the answer that the Jerusalem Talmud says? The Jerusalem Talmud says that Rabbi Yochanan was able to recite an after blessing, and the reason he was able to recite an after blessing even though he only ate an olive, is because of a famous law called beria. Beria means something that is in the form of its creation, the way it was. It's intact fully. It's a complete item. And being a complete item, it is considered a entity that deserves an after blessing. So we've been learning that you need a kezias. You would need the size of an olive in order to be obligated in a blessing, in a after blessing. However, the Jerusalem Talmud says that there is a situation where you would be obligated in an after blessing, even if you didn't have the size of an olive. If you ate a complete olive. And that is how Reb Yochanan was able to recite an after blessing. Now, the question is, does our Gemara argue with that Jerusalem Talmud? If our Gemara argues with that, then we should not follow it, because the law is that we follow the Babylonian Talmud when it argues with the Jerusalem Talmud. However, some rabbis want to say, some commentaries want to say that it's not arguing. That we could answer the contradiction by explaining that the way our Gemara understood it, where you remove the seed and salted it. And since you removed the seed and salted it, it's not exactly in the original form. But if you ate it complete, then you would recite the bracha on this olive, even though it's smaller than the size of an olive, because you're going to eat around the pit. You're not going to eat the pit, but because it's complete, you would be able to recite an after blessing even on an olive. So the Jerusalem Talmud is talking about where you didn't remove the seed beforehand, and the Babylonian Talmud is talking about that you removed it beforehand, and therefore it's not really considered a beria. And because it's not considered a beria, therefore it would not be you would not be able to recite an after blessing unless you actually ate the size of an olive. So that is the way you could answer the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. And according to that, it's very interesting, because what comes out is in the Shulchan Aruch, chapter 210, it says that if a person eats less than a kezias, less than the size of an olive, the law is you recite a beginning bracha, but you don't recite an after blessing. And then it says, but that some are unsure, yesh mestapkin, some are unsure, that maybe to say on something that is kibbur yasoi, that it's like its form intact, the way it was created, like a gargir shel onav, like a grape, that you would recite an after blessing, even though it doesn't have a kezias, even if it's smaller than the size of an olive, some say that you would recite an after blessing. Therefore, it's proper to be careful not to eat less than the size of an olive, because you will enter yourself into a question, should I be reciting an after blessing or not? If you ate a beria, something that's the way in its form intact, the way it was created, then you would be entering into a questionable gray area. And instead of doing that, you should just eat the size of an olive, and then you don't have a problem.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Yes. So
Simone has her hand up. Yeah.
yes. So in the Torah it says how the fruits of Israel were so huge, right? They had to have the pole to carry the bunch of grapes. Everything was much larger there. So maybe in the Yerushalmi Talmud, they said that because their olives were the size of plums. So that was actually like you ate something, even if you only ate one, even if you only took the seeds out. So they sort of saw it as, that's what we see in our fruit there.
Yeah, it sounds good. The only thing is that it's very easy to say things like that if you don't read it inside. But you read the Jerusalem Talmud, it says beria. It gives the term beria. You know what I mean? You can't explain it that way. It's great being able to we should like throw our own answers, but it has to fit. You know what I mean? It doesn't fit in the wording. So the Jerusalem Talmud doesn't follow that logic, even though it sounds good. I like it that you connected it with the Chumash. Very, very, very good thought. But it doesn't fit. The Jerusalem Talmud says there the word beria, that it's the way that it's intact, and it's the way it's created. It's a common term. There's halacha applicability of the word of this term beria as well in many areas. For example, things that are nullified, they don't get nullified if they're intact and so on. Yes, Susan.
Okay, so if I eat one currant, which is very tiny, that's not the amount for an after blessing.
But if it's complete, I don't know what a currant is, but if it's
currant
complete,
is a very tiny berry. Very tiny.
Right. So if it's complete,
it could be eaten fresh. It is if it's complete, but it's not the size of an olive.
An olive, right? So what you would want to do is only eat a few of them.
Okay.
Or only eat a half. Either only eat a half or 3/4, or only eat a lot of them.
Okay, I understand. That's what I was thinking.
Either less than either it's not the way it is intact, or more than an olive. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Now, in the same law, it mentions also about wine, that when a person drinks wine, some say that the size. I'm almost done. Just wait one more minute. The size for wine. The size for wine, some say, is also the size of an olive. And if it's the size of an olive, then you would need to recite an after blessing, even for drinking a tiny amount of wine. And therefore, when it comes to wine, if someone's pouring you some wine, you tell them, listen, you either give me less than the size of an olive, you got to give me a full 3 ounces, the revius. Because if you give me anything in the middle, it's questionable. Do I say an after blessing or not? Because wine could be the size of a kazayas. Some say that that's the size. Okay, we are going to stop here. I want to wish all of you a very good Shabbos. Sei gesund.
Good
A great Shabbos, Rebbe.
Shabbos, Rabbi.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Shabbos.